Welcome to the first manual S-World UCS Res V4 simulation. I'm working from two screens here, reading from one and videoing another, which leads to pauses from time to time. Sorry about that. This simulation may be slightly optimistic about trade and the amount of real estate and cities sold, but it could equally be well short. We're not focusing on these variables, rather the general overview of what Res V4 can do. The simulation starts in 2024 with 5 billion in revenue. That's initial revenue. It's not the same as revenue, but that's why it's got that little accent over the R. E is 90%. E is quantum efficiency. And spin is 8, which generates 25.6 billion in cash flow from just 5 billion in revenue, which creates roughly half of the cash flow will end up as GDP. 18.75 is currently allocated to government spending, and Labour would receive 6.4 billion of that. That's 25% for Labour. How we arrive at these figures goes straight to the core of the RES equation. Revenue times efficiency times spin, as is told in significant detail in Chapter 4, the RES equation. To summarise, let's move to 2025 and start with the grand total of all revenue seen at C51. Okay, now we have revenue aid, we have revenue exports, we have revenue real estate sold, and we have revenue entire city developments started. These are added to this, the LCR, which we'll cover in a little while, and create a grand total of all revenue, which then gets put at the beginning of the RES calculator. This section here I call the RES calculator. It is then, this revenue is then multiplied by the E for efficiency of 90%, which is in effect the percentage of this revenue spent to other companies in the same network. That's very important. 90% of which is in effect the percentage of this revenue spent to other companies in the same network. So the other companies, the network as a whole, still has 90% of that revenue. Okay. This cash flow is then spent before the 25th of February 2025. And the cash flow that remains in the network is free to be spent again come the 26th of February, and is allocated back to the first column of the RES calculator, one row below, ready to repeat the process. So this just repeats to here, and repeats the process, is times by 90%. So 90% of that money goes to other companies in the network again, which is spent by April the 19th. Therefore, this income goes back to here, times again by there, and so on until 8 spins. This process repeats 8 times. Each process is called a spin, resulting with a 513 increase in cash flow seen at 014, created by the spending and respending of the same money minus e-spillage 8 times within a single year. Important to this process is whatever cash, this is very important, important to this process is whatever cash flow remains after the last spin is carried forward as revenue in the following year in an action called the LCR, Law of Conservation of Revenue. This money here, that's the last spin. Each time revenue decreases because 10% is lost, and at the end of it, this money, we put it down here, and then we copy it over to here, and that is added to the aid, exports, real estate, and city developments, and the grand total, which is then returned to the first cell of the res calculator for that following year. Note that in principle this is a different way of increasing the money supply and comes in place of the reserve rate technique, which increases the money supply more than 1,000% in most Western economies. This may seem ludicrous at first. It looks so much like there must be a mistake, but there's no mathematical mistakes here, that's for sure. And it's doing, at this point, no less than monetary policy reserve rate. Okay, I'm going to point 3, part 3. By 2027, revenue has increased to 8.49 billion. Let's go there. Revenue. Remember that comes from here, being a calculation of this, this, and this. Okay, revenue is up to 8.4, by which point both E and SPIN have increased. Note that E has gone up to 91 and SPIN has increased to 10. Cash flow has increased to 52 billion. It's all about cash flow. Year before, 42. Year after, 52. Revenue increases over the following years, and because of this, by 2031, aid is no longer a contributing factor. You see, we start with aid here at about 2 billion. There's a lot of aid, but you know, there's a lot of aid out there doing not a lot. Here, at least it gets to do a lot. Okay, so there we go. Next year, slowly decreases the aid, decreases again, decreases again, until 2031. Don't need it anymore. And in general, it would be assigned to another country, we hope, following the same process, but in their earlier lifetime. By 2032, revenue is 13.6 billion, E is 95, and SPIN is 12. Cash flow 118 billion. 2032, revenue, efficiency, cash flow. By 2033, we see a warning about a recession. Here's where it gets fun. Recession warning. And income from trade and real estate is halved. You see, we've already lost the aid. Income, exports, real estate, city developments, all of which is halved. But as E is increased to 99 and SPIN is increased to 16, cash flow continues to grow, as does GDP and government spending and labour's income. (2034) sees the recession worsen and income from trade and real estate is halved again. But as E is increased to 99 and SPIN is increased to 16, cash flow continues to grow to 138. So cash flow the previous year was 127, and now the recession's really hitting. And this is a quarter of what it was just 2 years before, but cash flow increases, so does GDP, so does government spending, so does labour. And in general, until 2050, I have sought to always increase cash flow year on year. GDP, government spending, and labour's income are all factors of cash flow. GDP is 50%, so from 138 billion in cash flow, we get 69 billion in GDP. Government spending is 18.75%, so 26 billion. Labour receives 25%, so 34.69. Although to a degree, 50% of what Labour spends its money on could be allocated as government spending, so you can flip that around if you want. Okay. Recession ending. Phew. Well, actually, it's bad for the rest of the world, not bad for Malawi resort. Okay, in 2035, the recession eases, exports double, spin is increased to 20, and as a result, cash flow increases significantly to 217 billion. This is the biggest jump so far, from 138 to 217. With the we've still got the strong high E, we've got a lot of spin going on, but we're also getting new income from here, and that just went crazy. Okay. 2036, the recession ends and exports and real estate cities developments increase to pre-recession figures. Spin stays at 20, E decreases to 98, and the objective is to steadily decrease spin and E so that it can be ramped up again when the next recession hits without decreasing cash flow. In 2040, let's just go there and note the changes. 90 spin lowered to 16, E lowered to 97, spin lowered to 12, E lowered to 96, spin stays at 12, and there we are, 2040, E is 95 and spin is 12. In 2040, spin is down to 12, E is set at 95%, and cash flow is 296 billion. Exports are a modest enough 3.4 billion. So let's just look at that. Cash flow 296. Exports are only 3.4 billion, which is low for such an economy. So relatively safe, I hope. Real estate sales are just below 1 billion, and city developments bring in 10.75 billion. This is the main source of revenue that is not LCR in general. The main source of revenue is the LCR, the Law of Conservation of Revenue. You can see that is 18 billion. In effect, the 13th spin, passing over the unspent 18.8 billion from 2039 to 2040, whereafter this plus other revenue following E95 and spin 12 creates the 296 billion in cash flow and a kitty of 18.3 in LCR funding for the year before. So just to note that was the years before. Now, the last spin. That is transferred over to the next year in the 13th spin, because the money's got to go somewhere. It exists physically in cash. Maybe a good model is to think of all this money always being in cash. Always in cash, transferred from one company to another. Logistically can't do it, because, well, people would steal it. But that's how it works. It's always cash. It's always there. There's no problems with reserve rates. If everybody wants their money, the cash is always there. In this case, at the end of 2039, that cash has to go somewhere, so it's transferred to the beginning of 2040 and added to the other income that's made that year. Goes the beginning of the res calculator, and we've seen this before. Steady progress is made until another extreme recession, a depression, is predicted in 2043. Here we go. In reaction to the predicted slowdown, estimated by the now highly advanced Angel Wing software, I move E to 97 and spin to 14, increasing cash flow to 444 billion for an estimated 222 billion in GDP. So again, recession hits, E goes up, sorry, these go down, exports go down, real estate sales go down. Just a touch here, they go further in the next years, but we bring up the E and we increase the spin. And that increases the cash flow. So everybody else is worrying about a slowdown. Malawi is having an upturn. In reaction to the predicted slowdown estimated by the, sorry, I've read that line, the system for GDP was inspired by David A. Moss's A Concise Guide to Macroeconomics and the Siena Equilibrium spreadsheet tabs 006 and 007 found on the spreadsheet that you are looking at, which loosely predicts that cash flow creates a touch over 50% of output/GDP. For simplicity, I've factored 50% because it's better to be too low than too high. Note that as a further extension to this principle, Labour's cash flow dedicated to housing is halved, so that a $200,000 cash flow for Labour creates a $100,000 home. It's very counterintuitive, and I may be wrong, but it's better to predict too few houses than too many. However, this thinking also has other connotations, such as should trade goods sold be halved as well? This is the burning question at the moment, but we're leaving this point for now. In 2044, the recession hits, and in reaction, non-LCR revenue is halved, E increases to 100% and spin increases to 18%. And in the first year of the recession, cash flow, GDP, government spending increased by 42%. So the recession is now hit. Sorry, back. The recession is now hit. All of this, all standard income is now half. This is standard income from abroad, sorry. And E is up to 100%, spin is up to 18, cash flow 631, going to the next year 700, and now there is no income at all other than the law of conservation revenue and the fact you can spin it with 100% E. There is no loss. In 2045, the recession worsens, and now I pretty much start to maximize cash flow and show off the spin. As despite income from exports, real estate, and city development stopping completely in 2046, the Malawi network at spin 20 grows and grows. But this time, when the depression ends in 2047, I keep E at 100 and spin at 20 and start to focusing on reaching 1% of global output by 2050, and an increase in cash flow from 1.2 trillion in 2047 to 2.87 trillion in 2050. A whole new type of economics. You see, what we've done here up until this point is we've kept E as low and spin as low as we should, or as I thought I should at the time of making it, and I increase it when there's a recession to get past the recession, and then decrease after the recession, decrease E, decrease spin after the recession. But because when I first made this version, it only went to 2050. I just spend these last few years trying to make as much income as possible. So we keep the E at 100, spin at 20, and all other sources of income are restored. And there we're at in 2048, 1.6 trillion cash flow. 2049, 2.2 trillion cash flow. 2050, 2.8 trillion cash flow, 1.4 trillion in GDP. At this point, I started work on the controller. Here is the controller. But note this controller here, the one that I'm making for the software, is much more concise, albeit it's only working over the first 4 years. And even then, the spins are done for demonstration, not actual usage. This is okay. But getting back to this, we can see our standard res calculator, which I then divided by various different ways of spending. And here I went a roundabout way of working out housing. There is a better way of doing it, though, which I'm about to elaborate upon now. Social So at this point I started working on the controller, so I could see snapshots and factors such as social house production, healthcare, angel wing development funding, and other items. Social house funding is the easiest to work out. This is a thought experiment. Labour receives 25% of cash flow, and 25% of that, being 6.25%, is designated to social housing. So 6.25% of cash flow is designated to social housing, but with the personnel owning the houses they pay for. Therefore, social housing cash flow, if cash flow is 2.8 trillion in 2050, therefore social housing cash flow 2.87 trillion divided by 6.25%, which equals 179 billion, which if I divided it by $200,000 per property, I would have 897,000 homes paid for in 2050, that year alone. And by now, almost the whole population of Malawi is housed. Another interesting and simple statistic is the super project income of 93 billion in 2050 and 367 billion so far, found down column AV on the controller tab. AV on the controller tab. Let me find that. AV. Here we go. And there we have that 2050. Let's just get a date. Yeah, 2050 93. Money earned to date 376. Of which, sorry, one second. I just need to make an adjustment to. Okay, I'm not. Okay, sorry about that. Let me just refocus. Okay. Of which currently, of this money here, this 93 billion in 2050 or 367 billion in full total, of which currently half is dedicated to the Angel Wing software, Quest and S-World Films. Quite the war chest, especially if repeated again and again in over 50 countries, plus other income from virtual networks. Getting back to the display, we will return to this controller in a second. Getting back to the display, 2051 to 2080 were in part created as an afterthought, testing different theories. After a deliberate fall in 2051, after a deliberate fall in 2051, from 2052 to 2060, I focus on maintaining a balanced cash flow relative to global output, with results shown for convenience back on the controller from BE80 to BE87. As it would turn out, significant adjustments to E are all that was required. So let's just go there. BE80. BE80. Here we go. See, very, very, very similar figures each year. And that is created simply by changing E. 51. And then 52, E's 99, 53, 98.5, 2054, 98.7, 2055, 98.55, and so on. You get the point. Then from 2060 to 2070, I experiment with acquisition, adjusting E to 93%, dumping most of the highly prized LCR in 2060, creating a 222 billion in asset purchasing or developing cities in foreign locations, which in turn would create greater profit, greater export revenue in the long term. So here is our law of conservation with revenue. The last spin transferred to the next year had 240, but because E is lowered to 93, 222 of that is gone, spent on buying assets or actually building cities in new countries. You could see Malawi building a city in California, maybe. That would be an interesting turn of events, wouldn't it? Okay, but the next year, all that law of conservation revenue money has gone, and we need to rely on more income. And over the next few years, all I'm doing is replenishing that LCR, replenishing. You know, as I said, these are just experiments. These last 30 years. Okay, I've replenished now, and 2065 I do the same thing again, but in principle this time basically directing the money at Malawi, buying basically everything that hasn't been bought. And again, after that, I'm just down to 65 billion there, and I'm just replenishing. You know, it was just something I was interested in, so I looked to see how it would go. It becomes important in the following decade. Okay, and now I'm going to have to find my place because I've gone off script for a little bit. Okay, I call the last 10 years the peak tent versus a hyper depression. The peak tent can be found in the backstory to book 2, A More Creative Capitalism, and it can be found in chapter 3 of A More Creative Capitalism, albeit that is not online yet. I'm not going to explain it now. I'm just going to show the okay, the last 10 years I call the peak tent versus a hyper depression, in which I increase E and spin until a slowdown is predicted in 2073, whereafter I increase them some more, E to 99.9 and spin to 32, and then we're going to see 2 different versions of 2076. So let's just get down to 2076. Here's that slowdown, here's the recession. In 2076, I have 2 versions. One version is E at 100 and it's just riding out the storm, increasing E, making money. But in the other version, basically I follow that law of acquisitions again. I've lowered E to as little as I can and created 276 billion in actual cash that can be spent anywhere. Now we're going to go over to the controller. Now I need to, here we go. What happens is, and I've worked on the principle there are 50 other networks doing the same thing at the same time. So this creates basically 3.8% of global GDP in cash flow that can be spent anywhere, which I had hoped would be more than enough to put put any recession, depression, or hyperinflation threats at bay, but 3.8% isn't going to do much. The depression was 30%. However, if all of the other companies, if all of the recession countries have economic zones or are fully res, then that same amount of money creates a 70% increase in cash flow. 70% increase in cash flow can just take away any recession. If you've got 70% of the world's GDP, and that's a lot. That's a lot. You can really do something, but other countries need to be running res for it to do that. If they're not running res, it's going to do nothing. Okay, so that's something for the economists to chew over, and that's it for this presentation. Thanks a lot for watching. I do hope you get in touch. Bye.